Looking back, I never imagined that one simple moment with my brother could change everything. But when I woke up to find him standing in my room, his presence felt different, charged, almost like he was holding back something he couldn't keep inside any longer. What happened next left me questioning everything I thought I knew about us. I was deep in sleep, lost in the peaceful quiet of my room. The darkness was comforting, wrapping me in a sense of safety and serenity, and the only thing I could hear was the soft rhythm of my breathing and the faint hum of the air conditioning. It was a warm night, and I had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the day's activities. My body was still, my mind blank, and I felt completely unaware of what was going on around me. But then there was a shift. I felt a presence in the room, a strange awareness pulling me out of my dreams. I wasn't sure if it was the creak of the floor or something else entirely, but the air felt different now, charged, heavy. My eyes fluttered open, but the room was still dark. The quiet was unsettling. For a moment, I lay there, unsure if I had woken up or if I was still trapped in a dream. I turned my head slightly, and that's when I saw him, Mason. He was standing just inside the door of my room, his figure barely visible in the dim light filtering through the window. I could see the outline of his silhouette, tall and strong, with his back slightly turned to me. He wasn't speaking, and he wasn't moving. It was as though he was waiting for something, waiting for me to notice him, waiting for something to happen. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, heavy and uneven, but there was no other noise. My mind raced. Mason? What was he doing here, standing in the doorway of my room looking like that? I couldn't quite place the expression on his face. There was something almost vulnerable about it, something that made my heart skip a beat, but I couldn't understand it. I couldn't understand why he would be standing there staring at me like that. Mason? I whispered, my voice hoarse from sleep. He didn't respond right away, he just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. I blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog of sleep from my mind, trying to make sense of the situation. My heart was starting to race, my body suddenly awake, alert. This wasn't normal. I wasn't used to Mason acting like this. He was my brother, my best friend. He was supposed to be standing in my room like this, at this hour looking so distant. I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the confusion. What's going on? Are you okay? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, moving silently across the room, his footsteps barely making a sound on the carpet. As he got closer, I could see the tension in his posture, the tightness in his shoulders, the way he was avoiding looking directly at me. Something was wrong. I could feel it, but I didn't know what. Mason, talk to me, I said again, more forcefully this time, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. What's going on? He stopped at the edge of the bed, his eyes still fixed on me, his face unreadable. And then, without warning, he reached out, his hand cupping my face gently. Before I could fully process what was happening, his lips were on mine. The kiss was sudden, unexpected, and everything in my body froze. I didn't know how to react. Mason's lips were warm, insistent, and yet gentle, like he was testing the waters, unsure of how I would respond. The world seemed to stop for a moment. My breath caught in my throat, and my thoughts scattered in all directions. This couldn't be real, could it? This wasn't happening. I was still half asleep, surely, but as I felt his lips on mine, the sensation was undeniable. His hand was still on my face, and the warmth of his touch was consuming, making my heart race even faster. But then, just as quickly as it had started, Mason pulled away. I blinked, my eyes wide, trying to comprehend what had just happened. My mind was a blur. I was still half in a daze, but the panic was starting to set in. I looked at him, my breath coming in short gasps, trying to make sense of the situation. Mason, I whispered, my voice shaky. What was that? He stood there, his eyes wide, his lips parted, as though he didn't know what to say. For a long moment, there was only silence between us, heavy and thick, like the air itself was holding its breath. I'm sorry, he finally stammered, taking a step back, his eyes avoiding mine, his hands rubbing nervously against his jeans. I didn't mean to. No, don't say that, I interrupted, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you do that? Mason's gaze flickered back to me, and I saw a mixture of confusion and regret in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. He seemed unsure, lost in his own thoughts. His brow furrowed as though he was searching for the right words, but they eluded him. I don't know, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I don't know why. I couldn't stop myself. I've been thinking about it for so long, and then I don't know what happened. I stared at him, my heart still pounding in my chest. The shock was beginning to wear off, but the confusion was only deepening. Mason and I had always been close, but this was something entirely different. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. How was I supposed to respond to this? What did it mean? Mason, I don't know how to finish that sentence. My mind was still reeling, trying to find some semblance of clarity. What do you mean you've been thinking about it? What is this? What are you trying to say? He ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated with himself. I don't know what I'm doing. It's just, lately things have been different between us. I don't know if you've noticed it, but I have, and I don't know what to do with it. It feels like there's this connection, this tension, and I just couldn't ignore it anymore. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. This wasn't supposed to be happening. We were siblings. There was supposed to be a clear boundary between us, one that couldn't be crossed. But the way he was talking about a connection, about tension, it was like everything I thought I knew was being turned upside down. I don't know what to say to that, I said, my voice trembling. Mason, we're siblings. This isn't right. I don't know what you're feeling, but I can't think about this. It's too much. Mason looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and longing. I know, he said softly, his voice breaking slightly. I know it's wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I don't know what to do with these feelings. I don't know why I feel this way, but I do, and I needed to tell you. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. Mason, this is too much. I need space to think about this. I can't process it all right now. It's too confusing. He nodded, his face falling with disappointment. I understand. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done that. I didn't know how else to handle it, but I get it. There was a long, painful silence between us, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to make sense of what had just happened, or what it meant for us. All I knew was that I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened, but I didn't know where to go from here. Mason stood up slowly, his posture deflated. I'll give you space. I'm sorry. I had to tell you. I watched him walk out of the room, the door clicking softly behind him. I was left alone in the dark, my heart still racing, my thoughts in chaos. What had just happened? Did Mason feel it too? And what did it mean for us now? The days after that night with Mason were strange, to say the least. Things between us were quieter, but not in the way I'd hoped. It wasn't the peaceful silence I was accustomed to when we were both lost in our own worlds. No, this silence felt like something was hanging in the air, an unspoken question, a growing tension we couldn't ignore. At first, I tried to pretend like nothing had changed. I kept my distance, kept the usual routine, but no matter how hard I tried to push it down, I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me, the way he stood a little too close, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long. When we spoke, it wasn't overt, but it was there, this shift in the way we related to each other. It felt like we were walking on a tightrope, and one misstep could change everything. It was a Saturday afternoon when it all came to a head. I had been sitting in the room, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the thoughts that kept creeping into my head. Mason had been unusually quiet all day. He hadn't joked around, hadn't teased me the way he usually did. It was like he was waiting for something, or perhaps for me to say something first. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to address it, needed to know where we stood, so I stood up, my heart racing in my chest as I walked toward his room. I knocked softly on the door, my fingers tapping nervously on the wood. There was no response. I knocked again, this time louder, more insistent. Mason? I called out, my voice betraying the tension I was feeling. You in there? The door creaked open just a few inches, and there he was, sleeping in his room. I tried to wake him up, but felt like he was in a deep sleep. I couldn't control myself, so I leaned forward and started kissing him on the neck. It was so relaxing that I didn't want to stop. The kiss was so intense that it woke Mason up. What are you doing? He asked, sitting up in a confused state. I need to talk to you, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. But I could feel my pulse quickening. I could feel the heat of his body brushing against mine, sending a shiver down my spine. We had always been close, but never like this. There was something new, something unspoken hanging between us. I sat down on the edge of his bed, my hands nervously ringing in my lap. Mason sat up next to me, his eyes never leaving mine. The room felt smaller than usual, the air thick with the tension between us. Listen, I started, my voice shaky. About what you said the other night, I've been thinking about it. He didn't say anything, just watched me closely, waiting for me to continue. His silence made my stomach twist even tighter. I don't know what to make of it, I confessed, my words coming out in a rush. I don't know what's going on between us, but I can't stop thinking about it, and it's messing with my head. Mason shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine. That simple, accidental touch made my heart race. I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed still, frozen in place, as the heat from his body seemed to radiate toward me. I feel the same way, Mason said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I've been trying to figure it out too, but I can't. It's like something's changed, but I don't know how to deal with it. There it was again. The words we had both been avoiding, the words we were both afraid to say. But now that they were out in the open, there was no going back. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was how close Mason was to me, how his presence seemed to fill the entire room. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our unspoken thoughts pressing down on us. The tension was unbearable, and I could feel the pulse in my throat, my heart beating faster than normal. You know, Mason continued, his voice softer now, we don't have to figure it all out right away. We can just see where this goes, right? I turned to face him, meeting his gaze head on. His eyes were darker now, filled with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It was as if he was waiting for me to make a move, to say something, anything that could either break the silence or bring us closer. The space between us seemed to shrink, and suddenly all I could think about was how close he was, how much I wanted to reach out, to close that gap, to feel the warmth of his body pressed against mine, but I didn't. I stayed frozen, caught in this strange limbo where everything felt both wrong and right. Mason shifted again, moving so that his shoulder brushed against mine. The simple touch made my breath catch in my throat, my heart hammered in my chest, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks. What was happening to me? Why did this feel so intense? I'm not sure where this is going, I said, my voice cracking as I tried to keep my composure, but I can't ignore it anymore. I can't just pretend like nothing's changed. Mason nodded slowly, his face close enough to mine that I could feel the warmth of his breath on my skin. There was a moment where everything seemed to stop. Time slowed down, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Neither can I, he whispered, and then, without warning, he leaned in, just a little closer, his lips brushed against mine, soft and tentative, like he wasn't sure what I would do. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing as I processed the touch. The kiss wasn't too long, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through my body, enough to make my head spin. Before I could react, Mason pulled back, his face flushed with embarrassment. He looked down at his hands, not meeting my eyes. Sorry, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to make things awkward, but it was already too late. The moment had passed, but the feeling it left behind lingered like a weight in my chest. I didn't know how to respond, how to move forward. I could feel the tension between us building, threatening to break at any moment. I think I need some space, I said, the words coming out more harshly than I intended. I stood up quickly, unable to stay in that room for another second. Mason didn't try to stop me, he just nodded, his face a mixture of confusion and regret. Yeah, okay, I get it. I walked out of his room, my mind reeling from what had just happened. I had never felt so unsure of myself, so out of control. What was this? What were we doing? I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out, but I knew one thing for sure. Things between us had changed. There was no going back now. It wasn't until the next evening that I saw Mason again. The entire day felt like it had been a blur. My mind couldn't settle, couldn't stop replaying that moment in his room, the kiss that wasn't quite a kiss. Every time I tried to concentrate, my thoughts kept drifting back to the way his lips had brushed my skin. The air between us had grown so thick, I could feel it hanging like an unspoken challenge, something waiting to be dealt with, but something about it felt different. Mason and I had decided on a spontaneous long drive. Neither of us had a particular destination in mind, just the road ahead and a few hours to ourselves. The idea of getting away from everything for a while seemed perfect, and I could feel that unspoken energy in the air between us. We got into the car without much said, the sound of the engine and the soft hum of the radio filling the space between us. The city lights quickly faded as we drove, the quiet of the open road surrounding us. We didn't talk much at first. It felt comfortable, almost like we didn't need to say anything to enjoy each other's company. The steady rhythm of the tires on the road was soothing, and the night felt like it was just for us. After a while, Mason glanced over at me and gave a small smile. How about we stop for dinner? He suggested, breaking the silence. I nodded, the idea sounding perfect. We weren't in a rush, and the thought of a warm meal felt right. We pulled into a cozy diner that looked like it hadn't changed in years. It was the kind of place that felt timeless, with a warm glow spilling from the windows. Inside, the place was nearly empty, the smell of sizzling food and fresh coffee filling the air. We chose a booth by the window, and as we sat down, the tension between us seemed to ease. We ordered dinner, and just like that, fell into conversation. We talked about everything, old stories, our families, random thoughts that had been on our minds. There was something about the simplicity of it all that made the evening feel easy. We laughed more than I expected, sharing memories I hadn't thought about in years. It was the kind of conversation where you didn't need to try too hard. The words just came flowing naturally, and we both felt like we could be completely ourselves. Dinner came and went, and after, we drove a little more, the car winding through quiet streets. Our talk turned more reflective, about the future, our hopes, the uncertainty that lingered in both of our lives. I was surprised at how open we were with each other, how comfortable it felt to share those things. The evening was unfolding in a way I hadn't expected, and yet it felt like everything had lined up just perfectly. When we returned home, the quiet of the house seemed to embrace us. The night felt slow, like there was no rush to anything. We made our way to the living room, and without saying much, we both settled onto the couch. Mason grabbed the remote, and we quickly found a movie to watch, something light, nothing too heavy. We didn't talk much as the film played, but there was something different in the air between us, a shift. We sat side by side, the flickering light from the television casting shadows in the room. Every now and then, I'd look over and catch Mason's gaze lingering on me, just for a second longer than usual. It was as though neither of us knew exactly what was happening, but it was clear that something had changed, even if we weren't ready to put it into words. For now, though, the silence between us felt like enough. The movie continued, but the quiet understanding between us spoke louder than anything else in the room. As the movie played on, the quiet between us grew more palpable, and without thinking, I shifted closer to him. Our eyes met, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. There was a softness in his gaze, something unspoken but understood. Slowly, he leaned in, and before I could second-guess myself, his lips brushed against mine. It was gentle at first, tentative, as if we were both testing the waters. But then the kiss deepened, warm and slow, as if time had stopped for just a moment. It felt like a quiet confession, something we both needed but hadn't known how to say. The world around us seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound of our hearts beating in unison. Mason pulled back, his breath shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He seemed just as stunned as I was. I didn't know if you'd want that, he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. But I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know if you felt it too. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had so many questions, so many thoughts rushing through my mind, but one thing was crystal clear. Yes, I felt it too. But how could I admit that to him? How could I admit that the touch of his lips on mine had sent a fire through my veins, igniting something I had no idea how to control? I did, I said softly, finally finding the courage to speak. I felt it too. Mason's eyes softened as he stepped closer, his hands resting on my waist. I don't want to complicate things between us, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but I can't ignore this, not anymore. I don't want to ignore it either, I replied, my words coming out in a rush. The tension between us was palpable, and I could feel my body reacting to him, even though my mind was still in a state of confusion. My hands, almost without thinking, reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my fingers. Mason leaned in, his eyes locking onto mine with purpose. Our lips met once more, the kiss deepening with every passing moment. The sensation overwhelmed me. As our bodies swayed together, I felt an uncontrollable connection. His hands cradled my hips, drawing me near. Our heartbeats synchronized. I surrendered to the moment, letting go of doubts. His lips moved with a passion I hadn't expected. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing heavily, our chests rising and falling in sync. I couldn't look him in the eyes, I was afraid of what I might see there, but Mason gently cupped my face, lifting my chin so that I had no choice but to meet his gaze. Are you sure? He asked, his voice hoarse, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Because once we go further, there's no going back. I stared at him for a long moment, my heart thudding in my chest. Could I really do this? Could we really do this? But when I looked into his eyes, all my doubts faded away. There was something there, something I couldn't deny, something that had been there all along. I'm sure, I whispered. And then, once again, our lips met, this time with the full force of everything that had been building between us. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the beginning of something neither of us fully understood, but something we knew we couldn't walk away from. After that day, every time I looked at Mason, there was a new layer to our relationship that I wasn't sure how to handle. Our touch, once casual and brotherly, now felt charged. Every glance heavy with unspoken questions. What did it mean for us now? What was I supposed to do with these feelings that kept growing, swirling between us? Impossible to ignore. That night, after everything had happened, I couldn't sleep. The room felt suffocating, too small for the thoughts I was carrying. I tossed and turned, the images of our kisses replaying in my mind over and over again. I had never been this conflicted in my life, and yet there was a part of me that didn't want to stop, a part that ached for more. Mason had been quiet the next morning. We had avoided each other all day, unable to find the right words to bridge the gap between what we were and what we had been. I knew that something had shifted. There was no going back, but neither of us knew where to go from here. It was around midnight when I heard the soft knock on my door. I was surprised more than anything that he was the one initiating this. I hesitated for a moment before I got up and opened the door. Mason was standing there, his face a mix of uncertainty and determination. He stepped into my room and I closed the door behind him. The silence was deafening as we stood there facing each other, for the first time since this whole thing had started. I didn't know what to say. I've been scared, he finally confessed, looking away for a brief moment. Scared of what this means, scared of what people will think, but I don't care anymore. You don't? I asked, my voice shaking. The fear had been gnawing at me too, but hearing him say that made me realize how deeply he felt this too. No, he said firmly, looking back at me with a strength I hadn't seen before. Not anymore. We have to face this. I don't want to hide anymore. I want you, and I think you want me too. The words hit me harder than I had expected. I wanted him. There was no denying it. The connection between us was undeniable, a pull that neither of us could explain, but one we could both feel deep inside. I do, I said quietly, stepping closer. But I'm scared too. Mason nodded. I know, me too. That was all I needed. We were both all in. There was just us, and the connection we had shared from the very beginning, now blossoming into something deeper, something neither of us could fully comprehend, but something we were willing to embrace. As the night went on, we learned each other's rhythms, each other's desires, in a way that felt both new and familiar. And there was a vulnerability in the way we explored one another, a rawness that left us both breathless, tangled in emotions we hadn't known we were capable of feeling. Hours passed, but we didn't stop. Every touch, every kiss, felt like it was pulling us deeper into a world we didn't want to leave. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, we finally slowed, both of us exhausted and yet somehow still craving more. I lay beside him, our bodies still entwined, our hearts slowly finding their normal pace. Neither of us said anything for a long time, but the silence felt different this time. There was no awkwardness, no confusion, just peace. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I knew exactly where I belonged. I don't know what will happen next, I said softly, breaking the silence, but I know I don't want to lose you. Mason turned toward me, his expression gentle. You won't. We're in this together no matter what. As the days went by, things didn't settle the way I thought they might. There was no perfect answer, no clear path forward, but for the first time, I didn't need one. We were facing this together, and for me, that was enough. Whatever came next, I knew we would figure it out together. We didn't have all the answers, we didn't know where this was leading, but we knew that whatever it was something worth fighting for. In the days that followed, we worked to find a new normal between us, learning how to be around each other without second-guessing every glance or touch. It was far from easy, and sometimes doubts would creep in, making me wonder if we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. But each time I looked at Mason, a steady certainty would replace my worry, reminding me of the choice we'd made. There were close calls, moments when we nearly let something slip in front of family or friends. The tension between our public lives and the private world we shared was both exhilarating and strange, like a balancing act, and yet it also brought us closer, as if we shared a secret that belonged to us alone, a bond no one else could even imagine. At night, when the house was quiet, we'd find each other in the calm of one of our rooms. We'd talk in whispers, laughing softly, sharing everything we couldn't say in daylight. Those nights became our haven, moments when we could be ourselves without thinking about anyone else. Sometimes Mason would speak about the future, his voice filled with both hope and a hint of worry. "I don't know where this is leading us," he'd say, his hand finding mine, "but I do know that I want you beside me, no matter what." Hearing him say that gave me a comfort I couldn't put into words. I didn't have all the answers either, and I didn't know what lay ahead. But with Mason, I knew I wouldn't face it alone, and that reassurance was all I needed. Slowly, we began to shape a quiet, shared life, one filled with simple moments, touches that held more than words, and glances that spoke volumes. The uncertainties ahead still lingered, but they felt smaller, less intimidating with him at my side. We knew challenges would come, and that life would throw obstacles in our way, but we were prepared to face them, our bond stronger than anything we'd known together. We felt unshakable, ready to take on whatever came next. In the end, it wasn't about where we had come from, or where we were going. It was about us, here and now. And that was a story I was grateful to live day after day, with him beside me.